Revival. It's a word that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. At its essence, what it means is times and seasons in which God, by His Spirit, has moved sovereignly, powerfully in the midst of His people. Sometimes revival has shaken a region. Other times it's just awakened a church. Many times it's awakened an entire generation. There was a woman named Myrtle Beale. She was a housewife in Detroit during the Great Depression. In the 30s, after being filled with the Holy Spirit, she decided to start a sidewalk Sunday school for kids. And as the kids began to come, their parents began to join them, and it turned into a church. She leased out a small building, an old tire store, and it turned into the first location for Bethesda Missionary Temple, a growing Pentecostal church in the heart of Detroit. When World War II hit, as the church was growing, she made a dedication. She said, we're gonna pray for every single one of our troops that are going to the battlefield, and we're gonna pray for revival in our city. And for 7 years, every single day, Bethesda prayed for revival. The war came and the war went, and all of their soldiers came home. Not one of them from Bethesda was injured, but the prayer meetings for revival continued. In the midst of those prayer meetings, God spoke to her about a powerful outpouring. And He gave her a command. He said, I want you to build an armory for revival. Well, during the war, there was no way for them to buy steel, so all they could build was the basement. They built the basement and they moved into it and they began to worship the Lord. Just weeks before they were supposed to move into it, she heard about a mighty outpouring of the Holy Spirit that was taking place in Vancouver. There was no Google, there was no internet at that time. If she wanted to see it, she had to go. So she jumped in the back of a car, traveled across the United States 2,500 miles, and sat in on these meetings. In the middle of one of these meetings, one of the men pointed her out in the back and had her stand up and gave her a prophetic word and said, God is calling you to go home and to build a spiritual armory. Imagine the confirmation of that word. So she gets back in the car, she comes back home, she makes it home in time for the church service that took place on December 5th, 1948. And as her son began to lead worship in the basement of Bethesda's first building, the Holy Spirit descended in such a powerful way. For an hour, people began to sing spontaneously in the Spirit. The word went forth in a powerful way, and the only word to describe what began to happen is the word revival. Later that year in February, they moved into their 2,000-seat sanctuary called the Armory. And it's actually this room that I'm sitting in right now. These are the original seats. This is the original room in which the Holy Spirit fell powerfully in Bethesda. My grandparents were a part of that revival. In 1948, they were Bible college students, and they were here in this very room when the Holy Spirit descended. People said that when worship would ascend out of this room, that the voices would all go quiet, and above the voices of the people in the room, you could hear the voices of angels that were singing praise to God. On their opening day, they had to turn away almost 2,000 people who came hungry for a move of God. And for the next several decades, this very room would become the epicenter of what later would be referred to as the Latter Rain Revival. What happens to a revival after a period of time? Does it just flare up and then dissipate? There's a principle that God has taught me about revival as I've studied it. It's called the dandelion effect. As soon as the sun comes out and the waters of spring begin to fall, these beautiful little yellow flowers, dandelions, pop up in your yard, and they have their moment and they have their season, but eventually they change to white dandelions that are seeds. And then when the winds blow on those dandelions, they dispel the seeds all over the place, and eventually the dandelion stem withers and it dies. Many people look at revivals like that dandelion stem that pops up, has its beautiful moment, then goes into decline, and then dies and it fades away. And if we're not seeing through the eyes of the Spirit, we'll have a tendency to just view revival as God's in a good mood and he just decided to do something powerful over here or over there. And if we think about revival like that, we actually miss half of the story. See, because the revival itself is beautiful, it's powerful, the move of God and the salvations and spirit of conviction, even the cultural awakening that takes place. Those are the things that make the highlight reels. Those are the parts of the story that are recorded in the history books. But the part of revival that we often miss is the third part of it. It's when the seeds of those revivals get blown upon by the wind of the Holy Spirit and they disseminate the DNA, the seeds of that revival to the wind, to places that you may never locate, never identify, but they begin to reproduce and multiply. The book of James talks about the former and the latter rain, that a farmer waits for the former and the latter rain before there is the harvest. On the day of Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit was poured out mightily in Acts chapter 2, that was the former rains. That was the outpouring of the Holy Spirit that propelled the church forward. I mean, this ragtag little group of 120 in an upper room, uneducated Galileans and followers of Jesus, turned the world upside down. They overthrew within 300 years the most powerful empire that the world had ever seen up until that moment. And then the church began to go into decline. It became known in church history as the Dark Ages. And it seemed as if the church had lost its steam. But the Great Reformation was marked by a man who is referred to as the morning star of the Reformation. Martin Luther has an awakening in his heart, and God restores to the church an understanding of justification by faith. Then, just a little while later, God speaks to a man named John Wesley, who becomes the greatest evangelist along with his friend, George Whitefield. They begin to preach in open fields in England and North America, and they spark what's known as the First Great Awakening. And then Charles Finney goes into the upper regions of upstate New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and he begins to preach, and spirit of conviction falls over factories and railway cars and churches and denominations. And then a man named William J. Seymour is filled with the Holy Spirit, and the Azusa Street Mission becomes the receptacle of the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. At the turn of the 20th century, it begins what's called the Pentecostal outpouring, what I believe is referred to as the latter rain. God in the last days begins again where he started in Acts chapter 2, pouring his Spirit out. And the scale of it is global, and his intentions are to take us all the way to the greatest harvest the world has ever known. I believe with all of my heart that the call and the mandate that God has for the church in this hour is not to back down, it's not to succumb to pressure, it's not to modify or morph, it's not to hide in the shadows, it's not to run for cover, and it's not to get into a protectionistic mindset. The call of the church in this hour is to get ready. It's to prepare ourselves, because God is about to move in an unprecedented way in the midst of this generation. God's not going to allow this generation to pass without experiencing a firsthand outpouring of the Holy Spirit. And I believe it's not just any outpouring of the Holy Spirit, it's going to be unprecedented in its signs, wonders, conviction, and presence. Get ready, because revival is coming.